don't see it. So medieval child memorials. Well, Mark already said my association with the society goes back decades. I hate to think how long. And indeed, child monuments and infant death were part of my PhD thesis at Leicester University. And over the years, I have really benefited from all the people who became friends within both the Church Monument Society and the Monumental Brass Society. So some of their names will pop up on your screens later on. Tonight's, or this evening's talk is then about medieval child memorials, but also myths and mistakes. And I have made a few of the latter myself, but there are plenty of myths, and I apologize beforehand to those who already know my work, because this is really going to be, in a way, a synthesis of work that dates back decades. Now, on the 3rd of May, 1257, little Princess Catherine died. She was the 5th surviving child of Henry III and Eleanor of Provence. And she was really only a toddler. She was, as you can see, 3.5 when she died. And this, you might say, family tree shows her there with the label Catherine qui mourut enfant, Catherine who died as a child. And that's interesting because at 3.5, she was dynastically of no importance. The couple, Henry III and Eleanor of Provence, had lost other children in infancy. But when Catherine died, we know from chroniclers, especially Matthew Paris, that the Queen fell violently ill and the King himself grieved so much he fell into a fever. And that, you might say, dynastically is strange, and it also goes against many people's preconceived notions about how people dealt with child death in the past. Because if you look at it, they had 4 surviving children in good health, including 2 sons. Catherine was only a toddler, and we all know from the past that the younger the child, the more vulnerable it was. And not only that, but Catherine had also been in very poor health. She was described by the chronicler as muta et inutilis, speechless and helpless. It may have been a degenerative disease, and throughout the records, there is evidence of her ill health. And yet her death was an enormous blow to her parents. Now, what happened next was when the king had recovered, he had a craftsman come over from Wells. At least we think he was in Wells because he was called Simon of Wells. And he paid for his journey with his tools of his trade. And then he changed his mind. The plan had been to have a gilt bronze, gilt copper alloy effigy for the little princess. But then he decided on something better, and I'll discuss briefly later what the reason for that may have been. And this new monument was definitely executed because in 1272, so 15 years later, the accounts of the king's goldsmith, William of Gloucester, showed that he had indeed delivered, and here's a whole long Latin text, which fortunately for you, I'm not going to read out in total, but you can read it. It was going to be a wooden effigy, a wooden core of an effigy, that was covered in silver and silver gilt. And not only that, but that was going to be decorated with 180 pearls and amethysts. So all in all, an absolutely splendid monument for a princess who was just a little child. Now, that inevitably, that monument has failed to survive with that much gold and silver and amethysts and pearls. That was likely to be melted down or robbed over the years. But there is something that gives us an idea of how rich these monuments could be. Because in Braga Cathedral in northern Portugal, there is this splendid gilt cast copper alloy II monument to Crown Prince Afonso, who died at the age of 10 in 1400. Now, this monument is a very fortunate survival, although in Portugal it is unique, and that has raised its own legends and myths about who might have commissioned it. I've got my ideas about it, most likely the king, but some would like to believe that it was his little baby sister who, when she became Duchess of Burgundy, finally had the means to commemorate her older brother, who she cannot have known, with this splendid tomb. I think it's more likely that it was the king himself. Whatever the case, this is an unusual tomb. The tomb chest itself looks like almost a blown up jewelry box. It's got these wonderful drôleries with little birds and monkeys here on these gilded panels. And of course, the effigy with its silvered head is splendid too. It is unusual, and there is a reason why this monument was so grand. And if you go with me and think that it was the king, it's worth knowing that John I, or Juan, became king of Portugal after a very bitter civil war in the country. And with quite a range of sons, his succession did look and was indeed assured, but he invested a lot in his elder son, Afonso. So when the boy died at the age of 10, it would have been quite a blow. And that is a good occasion, not just to create a wonderful monument, but also to underline the legality, the legitimacy of the new dynasty with a royal monument. The Crown Prince himself had a dynastically important name, Afonso, and Braga too had an important historical significance in Portugal. So this monument has survived, and it's been there all this time, and yet. Now, I'm at the risk of flogging a dead horse, if I can say that, of a very respectable social historian, Philippe Ariès, who died in 1984. But in 1960, he wrote the, in many ways, justly criticized book, translated into English as Centuries of Childhood. And within medieval childhood circles, the moment you mention the name Philippe Ariès, everyone sighs and groans and says, not again. But the problem is that some statements are very, very tenacious, and every now and again you run up against them. And that is because Ariès was by no means the first to claim that children in medieval life were, well, ignored, they didn't exist. And because people lost children at such an immense scale, they couldn't afford to invest too much emotion into them. After all, if they're going to die, you cannot afford to be completely broken up. And here is a quote that I'm going to read out briefly. He says, and he states that he's used the Guignard collection, the famous antiquarian drawings produced around 1700 of two monuments in France. And he said, in the funerary effigies listed in the Guignard collection, the child appeared only at a very late date in the 16th century. Well, I've got doubts about that, as we've seen already. And then he said, no one in the medieval period thought of keeping a picture of a child if that child had either lived to grow to manhood or had died in infancy. In the first case, childhood was simply an unimportant phase of which there was no need to keep any record. And in the second, that of the dead child, it was thought that the little thing which had disappeared so soon in life was not worthy of remembrance. Now, there's an awful lot of problems here, because Ariès cannot have looked closely at the Guignard collection. He also failed to look around him. But then remembering, well, the problem is often with these statements that if you don't expect to find something, you won't see it. But absence of evidence does not equate evidence of absence. So already, if he'd only bothered to go to the Louvre, he could have seen this portrait, which negates his first statement, namely that there was no point before the 16th century of keeping a picture of a child that had lived or died. And indeed, this portrait, often attributed to the Maître Moulin, but probably Jean-Louis, is a portrait of the Dauphin Charles Orlan. And the frame actually gives the name and also tells us that he was 26 months old, and it was painted in 1494. So it's all authentic. And the lovely thing about it is that whether you think the child is ugly or not, I was shocked to hear some of my students say they thought he was ugly. It is an unusual portrait in that the child is not shown in royal robes, but in nursery wear. That in itself is highly unusual. Now, he was the eldest son of Charles VIII of France and Anne of Brittany, born on the 11th of October 1492, so this portrait must have been made in December 1494. You may not have heard of a king, Charles Orlan, and that's indeed the case. And the moment you know what happens next, the portrait acquires a different feeling, at least it does to most people, because a year later, the poor boy died of measles. So he was perfectly healthy when he was painted here, and then unexpectedly, to the grief of his parents, he died. And so did his baby brother, who was born after him in 1497, Francois, and the two of them are commemorated in this tomb monument in Tours Cathedral. And there, because that tomb monument does date from the 16th century, you might say that Philippe Ariès is right. It is indeed a monument of the 16th century. But as I said earlier on, he can't have looked too closely at the Guénière collection because there were plenty of examples of tomb monuments dating to, well, centuries earlier. Take this one. Now, I'm showing here not the Guénière drawing, but an engraving from Montfaucon after a Guénière drawing. And what you see here is two standing figures, one of them standing on dragons, the other standing on lions, both of them carrying scepters. The fleur-de-lis is in evidence, but these are not the older boys you might think they are, because we know that these are twins. Incidentally, Guénière or Montfaucon got it wrong because they're called Alphonse and Jean. But these are infant twins who died shortly after birth in 1213. The monument was created later, but clearly in 1213, what was important then wasn't just the remembrance that Ariès dismisses of no importance with children who died so young, a big misnomer, mistake, but also the fact that, well, there is this problem of how do you identify this? If he'd only looked at the images, you can well understand he could have mistaken them for adults. Why are they not shown as babies? Well, monuments are not just about affection. They are also about status. And of course, the big mistake that Ariès made, one of several, was that not every adult, let alone child in the medieval period, was commemorated with a monument. There were other forms of remembrance, even simple ones like masses and candles being burned, and those were at least as important. Monuments, tomb monuments, are just one aspect of commemoration or remembrance. So that's one mistake. But there is that problem, why the boys don't look like babies. And they're not unique, because here is another Guénière drawing, this one in the Bodleian Library in Oxford. And this is the gilt copper alloy in Limoges enamel tomb slab of another little prince, Prince Jean, born and died soon after in 1248. And he was the son of Louis IX and his wife Marguerite of Provence. It used to be in Royaumont Abbey, and it was part of a larger war tomb. But interestingly, and again, evidence that Ariès cannot have searched for evidence very well, carefully, because the tomb slab actually survives, and here it is. It's now at Saint-Denis, alongside that of his sister, who I'll show you in a moment. But that too is problematic because leaving aside the question of whether the Guénière drawing is completely accurate, what you see is a kind of ageless figure. And the twins I showed you just now in that Montfaucon engraving may have looked rather similar. Little Jean Tou's holding a scepter, so shown as a prince. Normally that's a royal emblem. He's standing on a lion. There used to be appliqued angels here. There's lots of heraldry, much of it lost because that too was separately cast and enameled. But on the basis of this, you couldn't really tell the age of the child. And there, of course, we've got the problem with medieval tomb monuments. Most of the time, they will only give the date of death, but not the date of birth, nor the age of the deceased. The only thing that mattered was the date of the transition from this earthly life to the better life in the hereafter. So unless you've got other evidence to give the age, ascertain the age of the deceased, you're left guessing. So that is one of the many problems. How do we recognize child monuments? Just looking at them can really give rise to mistakes and myths. There's also the question of whether these tombs are evidence of affection, and I already mentioned affection and remembrance can be expressed in different ways. Monuments can also be erected as symbols of status without them being evidence that the child concerned is greatly or was greatly loved. And that problem of how to identify children, you come across that over and over again. And of course, the notorious term is the one that Ariès also used, that of the miniature adult, the idea that children, especially in the medieval period, weren't treated as children. They didn't exist, but they were instead treated, regarded, and depicted as miniature adults. And for that, you can find plenty of evidence. Just look at this incised tomb slab or a rubbing of it from the Greenhill volumes. Pierre Desmarais, his wife Rose, and probably their son, now largely broken off, and then the diminutive figure of their daughter Perrette. The tomb slab dates from around 1333, based on the surviving part of the inscription. But how old Perrette is, if that is indeed her brother, he looks like an adult. Perrette is tiny, so may have been a very young child, but she doesn't have the proportions of a very young child. She looks indeed like a miniature adult. And that, of course, is what you come across over and over again. Notorious, famous are the range of children, often in a descending scale, boys on one side, girls on the other. Usually it's reversed from here, but I've taken this with John Baylis's permission from one of the brasses of the month on the MBS website. Philip, the husband, his date of death is given. That of the wife was left blank, so they obviously didn't know whether she might not survive into the next century. And their offspring, impossible to age unless you have the family records. They are all small figures. The girls, some of them have headdresses, so they were presumably married, but that still doesn't tell us all too much. What counted here was the number of children, and what they looked like, well, that was immaterial, but they were all there. Sometimes we know a bit more, but even there we are left guessing, because so many of these monuments, we're not even on safe grounds with royalty and the aristocracy. But when it comes to gentry, let alone burghers, then to find the right family records is extremely difficult. But if you look at this row of siblings on this rather unusual brass of Philippa Carew in Beddington in Surrey, she died in 1414. Now, her age too is impossible to gauge, but one must assume she lived longer than her siblings in the bottom. And well, either we're dealing here with a very unimaginative family, or they were determined that one of their sons should be called John, because there's one guy, two, three, four Johns, two Williams, then an Eleanor, a Lucy, two Agneses, a Margaret, and an Anne. They all look identical, but you can safely assume that what you see here are the siblings who had predeceased Philippa, And the family had tried very desperately to get a John. Presumably, they managed to have a surviving son called John on the fifth try, because that's when they must have moved on to the Williams. But there too, this is a family that lost, by all accounts, at least that's what it looks like, a lot of children. And then Philippa, who must have lived longer, died. And you might say the younger siblings lived it along. But notice, none of them look like babies. They all look like, well, there we have that term again, miniature adults. Now, sometimes you can just work out a bit more. This is the very worn incised tomb slab, or a rubbing of it, of Lady Alice Tyrrell at East Horndon, Essex. Now, Alice was born, and here again, we're on shaky grounds, but in the 1380s. And she died, we know that, in 1422, because that is what it says on her tomb slab. But the tomb slab itself was erected decades later, around 1450, by one of her sons. Now, the interesting thing is that her 10 children are all depicted on the slab alongside her. And they all carry labels. Look at this one. This girl is called Eleanor. But the last girl has her arms clasped, her hands clasped, and she has no label. She's nameless. And it's hardly likely that after several decades, they'd simply forgotten the name and thought, well, just include that one sister and we'll leave her nameless, too bad. More likely, if you look at the date of birth and death of Alice, Lady Alice, is that she died in childbirth, gave birth to a daughter who died before she could be baptized. And so she was included as one of her children, and also lifted along, maybe to heaven, but that's debatable, on her mother's tomb slab, but was deliberately left nameless because she couldn't be baptized. She died before that could happen. And that is a very real possibility, which means that all the Williams and Johns just now on that earlier brass, they must all have been baptized. And that's interesting. They lived long enough, at least, for that. Now, in this case, brasses, at least if they're complete, will give you an epitaph and names and at least the date of death. But when you're dealing with very badly worn outdoor monuments, because Sally Badham has shown that that is what this used to be, an outdoor churchyard monument, this unknown mother and her swaddled baby, or chrism, a term I'll explain in a moment, in Welby in Lincolnshire, well, early 14th century, we can say that. It's typical of that the area that the, well, not even half-length, bust-length figure of the deceased is shown in a quatrefoil recess. But then, almost as an afterthought, but actually sculpted in relief, is the figure of a swaddled baby. Of course, both of them are nameless. And in this case, you might even say that the baby might be an indication of the cause of death. What is interesting in the placement of that little swaddled baby is the fact that we know from archaeological evidence that babies were sometimes buried next to their mum, who'd also died in childbirth, near the legs, because that is the more narrow part of the body. And so in the grave, that is the ideal position that has been found. I don't want to say that that was routine. And what you can just see, because the slab is badly worn, is the swaddling. The crisscross bands are so typical, and the little human face now badly worn. Those crisscross bands, or those swaddling bands, are typical. But I already mentioned the term chrism, and I've spelled it with a Y, but that is based on the term chrism with an I, and this is another one of those myths. Tradition has it that a baby was brought to church to be baptized, and then if it died within a month of baptism, it would be buried in its chrism robes with which it had been baptized. If it survived, those chrism robes would be given to the church because textile was expensive. So By extension, every swaddled infant on a tomb monument has been termed a chrism. And then the next step is that that is termed, and you will find it over and over again in the literature, a chrism who died within a month of its baptism and therefore is shown as buried in its chrism cloth. But is that really a chrism cloth? Here we've got the brass of Robert Hayward in 1509, so we're already in the 16th century. And his brass includes two unnamed children. They're not mentioned in the epitaph. We know he died in 1509, but once again, the two children lived along on their father's tomb. Now, we cannot tell the gender of the christened baby, but this is very clearly a girl with very long hair, but rather incongruously, they are shown the same size. That can't be right. I'll explain about the long hair and the maidenly appearance of the little girl, but there's one thing that is important. Proportion, size often didn't matter on medieval monuments or in medieval art in general. So this is no evidence, although at least one psychohistorian has tried to use it as such, that children were swaddled up to the age of 7 or 12 or more. This is simply for visual balance, and it is artistic shorthand. One is a swaddled baby, the other girl had left her swaddling bands, and she's a girl and she was unmarried, and that's all we can say. But what then about those swaddling bands? Well, we see them over and over again, and this chrism brass, and I have to thank Martin Stutchfield for providing me with brass rubbings over the years, some of them actually not by him in this presentation because I couldn't ask him in time. But this one, the chrism brass of twins, a sister and brother of the Fiennes family, they died in 1491, and typical are those crisscross bands. And apparently this was the norm, of course, to swaddle a baby. The fear was that the limbs might grow crooked if you didn't swaddle them from birth, and then you'd gradually over the months release first the arms and later the legs. And the idea was that children would be kept safe and warm and they would sleep more in reality, but the worry was really the limbs growing crooked. But although everyone did this, and apparently I've never tried myself, my sister wouldn't let me use her children for the purpose, and quite rightly so. Apparently this could be done quite quickly, but to wrap a child in a cloth like that and then wrap those bands and tie those bands around the body, I would think that is not that easy. Now, I'll come to that point in a moment, because what is interesting is that to all intents and purposes, this is how babies were depicted. Swaddled children, swaddled figures, whatever their proportions, and notice the tiny faces on the Fiennes twins, totally out of proportion, they look like cocoons. But to all intents and purposes, these simply denote young children. There is no evidence that it shows them in their swaddling clothes, their chrism clothes. But note the cross here, because at baptism, the chrism oil was applied in other places to, among other places, to the forehead. And so the cross here on this chrism brass of Elaine Bray, who died in 1516, may indeed be significant. Here we might actually have at least evidence that she was baptized, and that would have been important. I'll come to that later on. So what about baptism then? As you can see here in England, that was different on the continent, but in England it was by total submersion. So no drops of water on the forehead. The child was really dunked in. So it would be soaking wet. And well, as I said, I haven't tried it, but to put a soaking wet child back into swaddling bands strikes me as a cumbersome procedure. Here, this lovely roundel stained glass from Leicester around 1500, 1520 shows you the process with the priest there and the godmother here, who seems to be carrying cloth over her left arm. But how would that have looked like? Well, as I mentioned earlier on, baptism was important. When you get brasses like the one in Beddington, the fact that all the figures show their names proves that they were indeed baptized. That's quite important. And the emphasis or the cross makes that very clear for the beholder that these were baptized children. But what about this brass? This always used to be described as a shroud brass or a partial shroud brass. It shows Richard Mansfield, who died, it says so in the epitaph, unusually, in 1455 at the age of 19. And then his young and fair sister Isabel, who is shown as a maiden with long loose hair, and the relative sizes, well, they're not in proportion, but she's clearly younger than 19. But then we get their half-brother John, and well, I mean, why is he alone dressed in a shroud? I can't help but think, especially when you notice the crosses on, I can only describe it as a bathrobe, that this may actually be a chrism cloth, because if you're going to dunk a child into a font, then this would be the ideal garment to wrap it up in. So rather than call this shroud brass, I would say that this is probably the one chrism brass we can be fairly sure of, but that's my interpretation. And as you can see on the slide, this is a brass in Taplow in Buckinghamshire, and quite a famous one. So back to Robert Hayward then, and the fact that we've got that chrism and not shrouded, but in swaddling bands. I see no reason to believe that he died within a month of baptism. You can call him a chrism, but actually he's a swaddled child, and that is all the indication we get about. He's a very young child, his sister is older, but for visual balance, they are the same size. Even so, there is plenty of room for mistakes, not necessarily on two monuments, but certainly in other medieval art, because sometimes shrouded figures are also shown as wrapped in a cloth and in swaddling bands. And you see an example of that here in the Winchester Psalter. Now that's quite an early example, 1150, 1160. And here in this detail of the resurrection, we see the trumpeting angels, and one of the corpses is completely dressed in crisscross bands, but there's no reason to believe that he's actually or she a swaddled baby. Sometimes you find it in other examples, and I've published on it elsewhere. You do find adults, but also children, shrouded with these crisscross bands, and it has nothing to do with baptism or the chrism cloth. But back again, because I mentioned earlier on the fact that the monuments in France, the royal monuments I showed you earlier, do not show infants. And so clearly in the 14th century, to find this chrism, let's stick with that term, this swaddled baby on the tomb monument in Welby is quite early on a tomb monument. In 1516, in Stoke-Davenant, the chrism brass of Elin Bray is by no means unique. One can find plenty of others also on the continent. So that, by that time, is not unusual. But of course, for royal monuments, how is it going to look? And certainly in the 13th century, if you erect a monument, possibly in gilt enamel, the copper gilt or alloy, gilt copper alloy and enamel, and then just showing that swaddled little package. So there are reasons of prestige again, but there could well be more, and I'll come to that later on. You do increasingly find an urge to go more naturalistic. An example of that is a century later, where in the 14th century, the marble effigies of Louis X, who died in 1316, and his posthumously born infant son, John, were erected. Now, they were two separate commissions. It's thought that the boy's mother, Constance, was responsible for commissioning the effigy of her son. It was a difficult situation. For those of you who like French literature or historical novels, I can warmly recommend a Druon series of The Accursed Kings, or Les Rois Maudits, about Philip the Fair, the king who, with the Pope, made an end to the order of the Knights Templar and got cursed by the master, the Grand Master, for that act. And certainly Philip's descendants, including his son Louis X, well, the dynasty basically died out, and there's quite a lot of scandal involved there. So great reading in historical novels, but that's beside the point here. The marble effigies here, in another Guenière drawing in Oxford in the Bodleian Library, show the king under a baldachin, and this was the arrangement until the Revolution. The effigy of little Jean de Posthume was placed alongside that of his father, but completely out of proportion, because the king died, his wife was pregnant, his second wife, and all hopes were vested in this unborn child. If a girl, she couldn't inherit. If a boy, one had to see whether he would survive, and in fact he didn't. He died 5 days after birth. And his effigy exists still, but now in a different arrangement at Saint-Denis. And you see here that this is not the appearance of a 5-day-old baby, but it is very childlike. It's got a little coronet with, kind of replica gemstones, the curly hair, the baby-like face. It's more like a toddler, but it has real charm. It's a beautiful effigy. It still goes with convention, the hands folded in prayer, the feet on a lion. He's now lying there alongside his half-sister, the daughter from the king's first marriage, Jeanne de France, but it's not a baby. And that's true of this one too, but this one has yet another myth attached to it. This monument in Besançon, in the local museum, is the tomb effigy of Jean de Bourgogne, the infant son of the very powerful Mao d'Artois, who was married to the Duke of Burgundy, Otton IV. Now, we know from records that this monument was created in 1315. There is an invoice for that. But it's made of marble. It shows clearly a young child, but it was only when people started looking at the records, they discovered that Mao had given birth to a son who must have died before 1302 and clearly in infancy, but the effigy was only created later, and then the situation became more complicated, because just notice the hands or the arms here truncated. In later times, the little statue effigy was put upright and made into a cult votive statue of Saint Philibert, a saint. And so it took a long time before it all came together, the fact that this was not a saintly statue, but a tomb effigy and the identity of the child. But once again, clearly a baby, that much is clear. But how old he was when he died, even the records don't tell us that. And then we get to miniature effigies, and there is another huge realm for misinterpretation. I do remember people sending me photographs or ringing me up or emailing me and saying, I found another child monument for you. And I would say, well, what makes you think it's a child? And the answer would come back, it's small. And believe me, size does not always matter. A notorious case is that of the so-called boy bishop, which made it into the literature. It's in Salisbury Cathedral. Here is an engraving from 1845. And the thought was that this is a boy bishop, part of the season in December when a chorister, young chorister, was elected bishop for the day, and it's one of those topsy-turvy medieval traditions. And this particular boy bishop is supposed to have died while still in function on that very day. And so a small effigy of the boy bishop was put up in Salisbury Cathedral. But of course, and in a fairly recent wonderful article in the journal Church Monuments, Sally Badham discusses heart and entrail monuments, and she has included this and identifies it as probably the heart burial of Bishop William de la Corne, who died in 1291. It doesn't show a heart, but the fact that it was small, and you have to be aware of this medieval custom amongst those who could afford it, of having separate heart and even entrail burials in different places, so that there are different foci for prayers for your soul, and different monuments as well. And heart and entrail monuments are usually smaller, but they don't always show very clearly what is going on, except the size, but not a boy bishop then. And here is another example, one of 3 in Berkeley Church in Gloucestershire. As Nigel Saw has pointed out, certainly to me in the past, the Berkeleys seem to have been rather fond of heart burials. There are other examples, and these are almost certainly to members of the Berkeley family, unidentified. It's one of 3, but although earlier church guides, and perhaps even nowadays, claim they are 3 children of the Berkeley family, I think there is enough reason to dismiss that suggestion. This one is late 13th century and some 71 centimeters long, but with the little curls, however childlike it looks, it doesn't seem to be holding a heart. I've looked very closely. I think the hands are folded in prayer, but well, it's debatable. But heart burial is the most likely. And that's even clearer here, and I'm very grateful to Cameron Newen for allowing me to use several of his wonderful photographs, including these 2. This, in the church guide when I went to Coberley in Gloucestershire, not far from Berkeley, so again, Berkeley territory, this is always claimed to be the daughter of the couple whose monument sits alongside it. But this is very clearly a heart, or less likely an entrail memorial, because this anonymous female figure actually is in the process of opening her bodice to indicate her heart. And so that in itself is a very good indication we're dealing not with a child monument, but with a heart monument. Although, just to confuse matters again, one has to say that I know of at least a few royal cases of royal children also undergoing that process of heart burial. So there's always that possibility, but not so likely with the Berkeleys. And then we get another myth or mistake, the so-called notorious Stanley Boy in Elford Church in Staffordshire. History and even recent sources claim that this commemorates John Stanley, the last male heir of the Elford Stanleys, who was fatally hit by a ball around 1460. It's a wonderful story, and I have published on this elsewhere, and the link is there if you want to check it out on the Church Monuments website, which is well worth a visit anyway. Most likely thing, and I'm grateful to John Bayliss again for recent discussions, is that, well, it looks too good to be true. Just look at that Latin motto on that brass plaque, which is definitely later, ubi dolor ibi digitus. Where the pain is, there is the finger. So he's supposed to indicate the side of his head where the tennis ball has hit him, and the tennis ball is in his left hand. It can't be clearer. Except that, as John Bayliss has proposed, in the 16th century, the then incumbent almost certainly moved some not Stanley monuments from dissolved convents elsewhere and moved them to the church and simply appropriated them as Stanley monuments. And because this one was so unusual and possibly rather battered as well, and because it attracted tourists, my assumption is, but I can't prove it, although it does look too good and too pristine, that at some point in its history, it was replaced by a copy that was not unusual. That was seen as perfectly legitimate. If something was of historical significance, I've seen it happen at York Minster, but looked rather unsightly. You had a copy made as good as, but you just changed some of the details. So why not make it a little bit clearer what happened? And so if you can compare it, we're not that far from these miniature effigies. The only thing that they may have changed is raise the hand a bit further from what it was here. Another one of the Berkeley miniature effigies in the windowsills of the church. And then instead of the heart, you've got a ball. Well, that heart may have given rise to the story of the boy hit fatally by a tennis ball. So overall, and it's interesting that this was published in 1852 in Edward Richardson's book, because Richardson was responsible for restoring the monuments in Elford Church, just as he'd done notoriously in Temple Church, London. But in this case, he remarked that this particular effigy needed very little work because it was almost pristine, and that in itself is already suspect. It may not have been medieval, and it certainly doesn't look 15th century in date. It looks 13th century. And not only that, but I checked everywhere to find a John Stanley who had been killed by a tennis ball. And you would have thought the last heir of the Stanleys around 1460 should be easy to find, but no. So if anyone has found him, do let me know. And then another myth while I'm at it. Again, I refer you to the Church Monument Society website, because this is another one of those monuments with a story. Lady Constantia is supposed to have been highly pregnant when she got lost in the forest, and then she was saved by the sound of the bell of Scarcliffe Church in the middle of rural Derbyshire. And so she made her way back to civilization, gave birth to a child, and as thanks, she gave a donation to the church and paid, I think, for church bells, but anyway, a big donation to the church. And this monument is then her monument to her and her son, John. And it's even got a wonderful inscription in English in Leonine verse, not in English, actually in Latin. But the problem is that it's so wrong. It's been published by antiquarians and beautiful engravings. It's been recently restored. The church has a wonderful myth about it, which I shan't even go into, but they've come up with a wonderful family history for the lady, but I haven't been able to find any Lady Constantia. Even Pevsner gave a name that I couldn't verify. And it just looks wrong. It looks, well, it doesn't look medieval. Look at that toothy lion. Lions as headrests, footrests fine, but not as headrests. And Harry Tummers, who wrote a very early book on all the 13th century monuments in England, left this one out because he felt it was very iffy. It's been claimed to be 13th century or 14th century, but to my mind, most likely it is a post-medieval forgery. But there are parent-child monuments. I already showed you the one of Louis X and his posthumously born son, and this is another unusual one because it's made of wood, of oak. It's now standing upright in the Germanisches Museum in Nuremberg. These are some of my not very good photographs, but this is Count Heinrich von Sayn, who died in 1246-47, and as with Louis X's wife, his wife too, Henry's wife, was pregnant, and she gave birth to a little daughter, but she died shortly after birth. And here they are commemorated together. Now, here we've got Heinrich as an adult and his baby daughter, who does once again not look like a baby. Just look at that long hair, which is, of course, very maidenly. And here we get that term, which I'll explain in a moment. He's placing a garland on her head, and that may signify that he acknowledged her as his heir. After all, she was born after his death, but of course she died herself. And the garland may have other meanings, including a maidenly garland or the garland of eternal bliss in heaven, supposing that she actually was baptized. But what about maidenly monuments? Now, again, that's another area I have published on and talked about for quite a bit. So here we go. The tomb slab I showed you earlier of little Jean, now in Saint-Denis, was actually part, just like that of his sister Blanche, of a mural monument with a painted niche. And those were originally placed in the Abbey of Royaumont. Those wall monuments have been destroyed in the Revolution, but at least the gilt and enamel tomb slabs have survived. But look, both children died in infancy. Jean shortly after birth, but his sister Blanche, who was the eldest child of the king, was, well, only a couple of years old, and certainly can't have looked anything like the maiden that she's shown as here, if we can trust the Gagnère drawing. Just like Jean can't have been the elegant young man with a hunting bird. And here we've got her in more detail. The fleur-de-lis is an evidence, but she looks like the ideal maiden. Now, why would that be? Why would you depict people like that? Various reasons have been proposed. It's more chivalric. It shows the children how they could have been if only they had lived. But more likely is that it shows them as they hopefully are in heaven. Because here we enter a different area, and the reason possibly why so many of these child and particularly infant monuments, and I have to say that one should distinguish between child and offspring, because a lot of the monuments I showed you earlier showed offspring, like those brasses, brass figures of descending scale. But when we're dealing with real children, we have to have evidence to be absolutely sure. Child has a very emotive value. But when we know we're dealing with children, and we do know that in the case of the little daughter of Heinrich von Sayn, little Catherine, and here Perron, and here, well, presumably, certainly the swaddled infant, but possibly also the maiden with long loose hair. There is a reason for that, or could be. And that's the only reason I can find, because over and over again, and I'm just showing you a handful of examples, you get monuments where we do have more evidence. And Joan, daughter of Anthony de Lucy in St. Bees Priory in Cumberland, is said to have been not yet 3 years old when she died in 1389. And look at her here. She is an elegant maiden or woman, in this case with her hair tied up in cauls, hands in prayer, but this is no 3-year-old or 2-year-old. And here too, the moment you start realizing that these monuments are not necessarily, well, portraits is a laden term, but true representations of their actual ages at death, then, well, anything is possible, really. And the maidenly brass of Margaret Brocas, alongside her brother Rawlin in Sherburn St. John in Hampshire around 1360, shows a brother with enormous ears. But just look at her with her maidenly loose hair, this flowery garland, and I mentioned the garland on the head of the little daughter of Count Heinrich in Nuremberg. And here too, now again, we're hampered by the fact that no age or date of birth is given, but here lies buried Clara Jacob's daughter, who died in the year 1536 on the 5th day of June. Pray for the soul. And here she is. Well, there's a bit of bust showing, so one may assume she was certainly an adolescent at the very least, but she was most likely unmarried, most likely. Because here we've got another one of those maidenly brasses of Cecily Boleyn in Blickling in Norfolk, and she died in 1458. But the brass epitaph states that she died in her maidenhood of the age of 50 years. And you wouldn't say that by looking at her, because here she is, an elegant maiden with long, loose hair. And okay, she was a maiden, but she was 50, for heaven's sake. And even in some brasses and monuments of married women, you find this maidenly hairstyle. Now, again, a lot more can be said about that. But most importantly, it is important to look at other sources, including literature and theology, and to go hand in hand in the case of the Pearl poem. Here we've got the crucial miniature in the only surviving manuscript of the poem in the British Library in London of around 1400. In the poem, a dreamer visits an arbor, a green arbor he calls it, in a warm day in August, and he goes to the unmarked grave of a girl he refers to as Pearl, but clearly was his daughter. And in the heat of summer, high summer, he falls asleep and he has a dream in which he comes to a river, and approaching him from the other side of the water is a beautiful maiden dressed in white and pearls. And then I think it's wonderful. He says the line, "I knew her well. I had seen her before." But she is not, as it appears from the poem, the little girl who died not yet 2 years old. She introduces herself now as one of Christ's heavenly brides. And he says, "Oh, how can that be? You died before you could even learn your paternoster and your creed. You are only not yet 2 years old. How can that be?" And she now becomes the teacher of her father. She's got heavenly wisdom, and she explains to him that no, she didn't do any good deeds. She was far too young, but she had been baptized and cleansed of original sin, and she was too young to commit any sins of her own. And so she deserves her place in heaven as one of Christ's brides. And well, that in itself is moving. And here we see them, him on one side of the river with fish in them, and she with her hair tied up and wearing a crown according to the text, and standing there quite aloof and teaching her father. And despite all his assurances that this is her place and he belongs still to the world, he can't help himself. He tries to reach her, tries to enter the water to get to her, and then wakes up. And the wonderful thing is several things. Although he's lost a little girl who's not 2 years old, he feels so sad. He goes to the cemetery to mourn her on her grave. So he has still affection, and he remembers her. He has the need to be close to her. The grave is unmarked. He lies down in the place where he knows it is, but it may simply have had a wooden cross, which would have been the fate of most people in the medieval period. 2 monuments are very rare overall. And then he has this dream, and she, little baptized girl, becomes this ethereal heavenly creature, and he still recognizes her. And that is totally in line with theology at the time, because most people base this on St. Paul in Ephesians 4, where it says in translation, "Until we all meet into the unity of faith and of the knowledge of the Son of God, unto a perfect man, unto the measure of the age and of the fullness of Christ." And this, the phrase in verum perfectum, and the measure of the age and of the fullness of Christ, has been taken as we will all have the age of Christ in the hereafter. And because Christ was thought to have died at the age of 30 or 33, we'll all be 30 or 33. Except that for women, according to medieval standards, that was pretty much over the hill. Physical and mental perfection for men may have been that age, but for women, well, more likely the age of the Virgin at the Annunciation, which was 15 or younger, maybe as young as 12 to 14, depending on sources. And that was supposed to be the ideal, perfect, virginal, maidenly age. And that may be what we're seeing. That is what we see in the Pearl Maiden. She is being resurrected in heaven, not as the 2-year-old. After all, heaven would be a rowdy place with all these youngsters running around. They're all going to be in the perfect age, and heaven will be a very solemn place. And yet you're still supposed to recognize your grandfather at that age, but also your little son or daughter who died as a toddler. Difficult theological concept, beautiful, but for most people difficult to grasp. And so even respectable historians like Caroline Walker Bynum mistook this miniature in Cambridge completely, or at least whoever was responsible for the caption in her book did, because in her book it says that this miniature shows the resurrection and adults as well as children. But actually, the Latin text of Revelation 20 talks about, and I saw the dead, the mortos, magnos, et pusilos, the smaller, the greater and the lesser folk. And I've discussed this with the late Jerome Bertram, who confirmed that in the Bible, the word parvulus is used for children, but pusilos is not a reference for a child. It has to do with status. So it's not the young and the old, or the great and the small, it's the greater and the lesser folk. And as in Illuminator, how do you depict that? Well, by having some figures depicted small, but they're not children. And so we've come to the end of my lecture almost. It's confusing then, because we've got these maidenly figures who died actually much younger than they appear to be, but that may reflect their age in heaven. And remember how important it was. I already mentioned at the start with Philippe Ariès. He thought that remembrance expressed itself in two monuments. And if you didn't find those, then it proved that children were simply forgotten if they failed to survive into adulthood. But of course, that was totally true. We know, we have plenty of evidence of parents grieving over the death of young children. There were even special chapels and miracle stories where parents would rush to church with a child who apparently had failed to survive childbirth, and then pray to whatever saint, in this case, in this lovely grisaille miniature in Paris, the Virgin Mary. You would pray to whatever saint to revive the child. And in some of these miracle stories, the child is revived long enough to be baptized and then dies anyway, but that's still a happy ending, because baptism was crucial. Without baptism, children could not attain heaven. And at best, they might end up in the limbus puerorum or limbus infantium, where they would be denied the beatific vision, the face of God for all eternity. Not necessarily damned forever, as St. Augustine would have it, but not in heaven either. So, all in all, then, the last few slides, there is plenty of room for mistakes, and I'm pretty sure I have committed a few myself. But one can still propose a hypothesis. And here, I can't prove it, but this tiny little slab, or tiny but relatively small slab, certainly if you can compare it to the other one I showed you in Capella, which is much, much larger and almost life-size, this shroud tomb slab, or to Achte Klaasdochter, who died in 1469, age unknown, the fact that the epitaph makes reference to the fact that today alive and tomorrow dead, be mindful of that, it is great wisdom, may be a reference to the fact that there's no reference to her status, to marriage, and it's a small slab. Now, that in itself can be for reasons of economy. Not every adult had a life-size slab or memorial, but it's possible that this was the slab of a child. The image doesn't tell us so, but there's just that possibility. But even size can be deceptive, because when you look at this, an engraving by Richard Gough, based on a rubbing of the very worn incised tomb slab, or incised and inlaid tomb slab of Princess Eleanor, the inlays have largely gone, and the monument still survives in what is now the Motor Museum in Beaulieu Abbey in Hampshire. This was for the daughter of Edward I and his second wife, Margaret of France. Little Princess Eleanor was only 5 when she died, but her tomb slab measures over 3 meters in height. So here too, size can be deceptive. And all in all then, I hope in my lecture today, I have shown you the various pitfalls that can threaten those who venture into the realm of child monuments in the medieval period. But it's a field that is well worth studying, and I hope you've enjoyed it. Thank you for your attention.